Hello and most welcome to 1308, and I will today continue with Nisbett's fantastic book, Geography of Thought. While doing the lectures, I have found a lot of parallels to physics, and yesterday I could also add neurology. We usually regard the arena of thinking to be completely separated from reality, and the general idea that we can think, believe, feel, sense whatever we want is completely untrue. We can only have those thoughts that we practice, and people have ability to different thinking. This is something that becomes clear when we compare East and West, the different abilities to having thoughts, different thoughts, and also different qualities of thoughts. They are doing different things. If you remember from earlier lectures, when we spoke about the motor cortex and Bergen's book, Benjamin Bergen, who explained that it is the movement center in the brain that do the thinking, the one connected to the muscles, connected to how we move about. Probably best described by the Klein bottle, and it shows that for us to be able to have a thought, we have to have done the movement many times. Very similar to Jacques Derrida's idea of iteration or iteration. It's in the fractality of repetition thinking becomes possible. And this is of course something that is in sharp contrast to how we normally perceive thinking in the West. We think that we can grab ideas from wherever and that we can express them to the same extent as we want to. But the thing is, we can only think what we have been practicing. Thinking is in itself a practice. This is the reality of thinking, not separated from the world. And of course you understand this is as far as you can get from the Cartesian dualism. And actually it's very far from what we generally perceive in the West. I can think whatever I want. And this is actually the solution to a gigantic problem for me in another field, that is quantum mechanics. Because when I say to people, you construct the world, they usually say, well, then I can construct whatever I want. Then I'm free to choose whatever I want. Yes, that is true, but it doesn't mean that your thinking capacities are completely free. Actually, they are incredibly limited. A big investigation starting with Milgram has shown that people, when they actually try to think, cannot think what they want. And Milgram also showed that when he did his first studies, that must have been in the early 60s, with his rather distasteful experiment of killing off a guinea pig. He showed that most people would in the end pull the trigger on the person and kill him off. We are not in control of our thinking. We actually much less control of our thinking than our bodily movements. Also a lesson from Frederick Matthias Alexander. He met a vicar once, and the vicar said to him, "I believe in the angels and in God." And Alexander coarsely said, "You are not free to believe whatever you want. It takes practice." And he did a sort of a very early Milgram experiment, showing the person that he didn't have that control. He didn't have that belief at all. Rather, we are like the Klein bottle, interconnected with the outer world. If we want to believe in angels, we need to practice that for years, and it doesn't come cheap. So you see there are tangents both into quantum mechanics, neurology, science of cognition, and I would say definitely science of movement. But after that short introduction, I will get into the meat of the text. And I took off at the philosopher Nelson Goodman. The philosopher Nelson Goodman proposed that the solution to the riddle of induction is to seek reflective equilibrium between rules for inductive inferences and the specific inferences that we in fact make. This is what we do with deductive rules. We would abandon any deductive rule that required us to sanction inferences that we found unacceptable, and would reject any conclusion that was prohibited by a rule we are unwilling to give up. But suppose there are principles that don't reason as we do, and moreover don't even endorse the same principles of reasoning that we do. Philosopher Stephen Stitch has observed that this makes a shambles of the reflective equilibrium principle. If we don't agree about whether an inference is justified or not, we can't use the principle as a guide to correct thinking, just as an expression of personal preference. One solution is just to say that we were justified in our inferences, and they're justified in theirs, even if their inferences are completely different from others. Ours. This position of extreme relativism is an easy one to take, but no one really believes it. If you tell me that you believe that both of two virtually contradictory propositions are correct, I may politely say that I am sure you're right for you, but I am right for me. Is either of us convinced? Probably not. But I'm not willing to lie in this bed of relativism I've helped to make. On the contrary, I find that Asian patterns of reasoning cast valuable light on some of the reasoning errors of Westerners. And I believe the same mirror can be profitably reversed to look at Eastern thought. I will focus on just a few Western habits of thought that seem particularly illuminated by contrasting them with Eastern patterns of thought. Formalism. There's enormous power in the formal, logical approach of Western thought. Science and mathematics obviously rely on it, though just how much is a matter of dispute. Francis Bacon wrote that logic is useless. It is the creation that is science. And Bertrand Russell expressed the view that the syllogisms of the 12th century monks were as sterile as they were. Though I am inclined to agree, this is a puzzling statement, coming from someone who believed that all human problems could be solved by logic, but could apply only formal logic to real-world questions. In my view, this rendered his analysis of political and social questions naive. The chief cause of his problem was the insistence on separation of form and content, so that reasoning could be carried out using logical principles on the form alone. This is a Western ailment. As the philosopher S.H. Liu says, Chinese are too rational to separate form from content. A second problem for Russell was that, like most Westerners, he was largely lacking in what may be called the reasoning schemas of dialecticism. Many such schemas were identified by developmental psychologists Klaus Riegel and Michael Besech. These psychologists disagreed with Jean Piaget's view that most reasoning was carried out by means of so-called formal operations or logical principles, which were in place by adolescents. In their view, most high-level reasoning was carried out by means of post-formal operations. Reasoning schemas that are more complex and more tied to specific thought content than are logical rules. They were termed post-formal because they were assumed to develop primarily after the formal operations were complete. Both Riegel and Bassett believe that progress in development of post-formal operations continues throughout the lifespan. Some examples from Bassett's work include the following. The concept of movement from thesis to antithesis to synthesis. The ability to understand events or situations as moments in the development of a process. The recognition of the possibility of qualitative change as a result of quantitative change. The ability to take a stance of contextual relativism. The recognition of the value of multiple perspectives on a problem. The recognition of the pitfalls of formalism based on the interdependence of form and content. The ability to understand the concept of two-way reciprocal relationships. The ability to understand the concept of self-transforming systems. The ability to conceive of systems in terms of their equilibrium. Oddly, neither Riegel nor Bassett seems to have made the connection in print between their notions about post-formal operations and the dialectical aspects of Eastern thought. Though it seems highly unlikely that they were unaware of the similarities. In fact, it is probable that they drew on Eastern ideas for developing the schemas. The two Western vices of separation of form and content and the insistence on logical approaches often operate together to produce a lot of academic nonsense. There are plenty of examples from my field of psychology to point to. In particular, a great deal of formal modeling of psychological phenomena, most that I am aware of, fails to elucidate the phenomena it purports to. The joy lies in the modeling for its own sake, not in making sense of behavior. Economist friends have told me that the macho thing in economics is to pick some implausible principle and then derive as many phenomena as possible from it. Two-valued logic, the binary either-or approach to the evaluation of propositions characteristic of the West, has been lamented by many Western thinkers. But the problems are easier to see from the standpoint of the both and approach of the East. For example, the Western insistence that a behavior have a cause rather than extrinsically caused, but not both. And this is resulting in people seeing behavior either as intrinsically caused or extrinsically caused, but not both. So someone can act out of generosity or to satisfy some self-serving motive, but not for both types of reasons. Adam Smith wrote from this perspective in his famous defense of capitalism. It is not that he cares for you, the customer, that the brewer, the baker, or the butcher provides for your dinner, but because he cares for himself. But on reflection, why not both motives? Surely many merchants are primarily in business to feed their own families, but also like the fact that they are helping to feed others as well. This was recognized by Smith himself, but has been ignored or unappreciated by many of his followers. There's a cynicism about the motives of politicians that is characteristic of Americans, which, however healthy it might be for maintaining personal freedoms, is likely to produce some incorrect assessments. Neither Lyndon Johnson nor Richard Nixon is among my favorite politicians, but both were widely seen as having acted for political gain, when they did things that in fact they believed would lead to serious loss. Johnson was seen by many as trying to enhance his political capital by fighting for Kennedy's civil rights bills. But in fact, he knew better than Kennedy could have that he was signing over the South to the Republican Party for a generation. Nixon was thought by many to be seeking personal political gain by opening to China, when in fact he and many of his aides feared it would be an extremely unpopular move. There's a bit of evidence that Westerners may be more susceptible to this sin motive fallacy than other people. Developmental psychologists Joan Miller and David Bursoff told American and East Indian children about cases in which one person helped another person. In some instances, the helper expected reciprocation, and in other cases did not. The Indian children assumed that the helper was intrinsically eager to help, regardless of expectations about reciprocations. The American children believed there was an intrinsic motive to help only if there was no expectation of reciprocation. The fundamental attribution error. One of social psychology's most important and best demonstrated phenomena is the fundamental attribution error. The tendency to assume that the behavior of another person has been produced by personality traits or abilities, and to slight important situational factors. Critics have sometimes held that this tendency doesn't constitute an error at all. But East Asians are less susceptible to the error than Americans in some cases. And the error is more readily corrected for them when the situation is highlighted in some way. The critic can't have it both ways. Either Westerners are wrong in those cases when they ignore the implications of the situation, or Asians are wrong when they take them into consideration. The more plausible position, especially in light of the data showing that Americans are prone to attend only to salient objects and to ignore contexts, is to say that it is the Americans who are wrong and the Asians who who are right in these cases. Research on the fundamental attribution error has philosophical implications beyond the epistemological. The work is also important for ethics, a point emphasized by philosophers including John Doris, Gilbert Harman, Peter Vranas, as well as by many psychologists. They note that Aristotle's ethics, which has played a large role in the history of Western philosophy, is similar to his physics. People, like objects, behave as they do because of their properties. Virtues or vices in the case of the ethically relevant behavior of people. Aristotle's virtue ethics is more consistent with lay Western thought about moral behavior than with Eastern beliefs. Aristotle's system encourages you to assume that people are incorrigible, or to take the stance that behavior must be altered by changing people's attributes. A difficult thing to do at best, and counterproductive at worst. If you want to get people to behave as you, and often they believe they ought, an easier route is to encourage them to seek out situations that will bring out the best behavior in them, and to shun those that will encourage bad behavior. Such an approach to encouraging ethical behavior is more obvious from an Eastern viewpoint than from a Western viewpoint. Turnabout is fair play, and it is also possible to use Western principles as a platform for criticizing Eastern thought. A sketch of what that enterprise might look like follows. Contradiction. The heuristic, there is truth on both sides. May very well be a good one to use as a first approach to understanding any apparent contradiction. It may also be a good place to end up much of the time. It is not an algorithm best followed relentlessly. However, sometimes one proposition has all or most of the truth on its side, and the other has little or none. We have seen that Easterners are more willing to grant credence to each of the propositions that bear a contradictory relationship to each other. Than Americans are, and that they can be led into the serious error of believing a given proposition more when they see it contradicted by a more plausible proposition than when they merely see it by itself. This is almost impossible to defend on logical grounds, but can readily be seen as the result of an insistence on finding the middle way. Incheol Choi maintains that the relative insensitivity of Easterners to contradiction makes it less likely that they will have sufficient curiosity to become scientists. Whether this is a good or a bad thing is a matter of preference. But it is certainly relevant that the people who run Eastern societies at the moment happen to want to be able to produce scientists. Debates and rhetoric I share the Western conviction about the efficacy of debate for bringing out the truth, or at any rate, for keeping on the table hypotheses that may be useful. Western debate style and the mental habits it encourages are important for keeping societies open and open-minded. Debate also goes hand in hand with standard hypothesis, evidence, conclusion rhetoric, which science and mathematics rely on heavily. Earlier, I quoted physicist Alan Cromer to the effect that a geometric proof is the ultimate rhetorical form. Statistician and psychologist Robert Abelson has written a lovely book describing statistics essentially as a rhetoric. I believe the metaphors are deep and correct. Complexity. A Western thinker has said that if the universe is pretzel-shaped, then we must have pretzel-shaped hypotheses. True enough, but if we start with a pretzel-shaped hypothesis, the universe had better to be pretzel-shaped, or there is no chance we will find out just what shape it is. For any shape other than a pretzel, you're better off starting with a straight line and modifying it as it becomes clear that the linear hypothesis is too simple. Asians are surely right in their belief that the world is a complicated place. It may be right to approach everyday life with this stance. In science, though, you get closer to the truth more quickly by riding roughshod over complexity than by welcoming on board every conceivable relevant factor. Of course, prescriptive observations like those in this section only make sense if we think that people's habits of mind can be altered readily. Can they be? Teaching and testing. Should educators seek to give other cultures' skills to its children? Or should they focus on what is defined as important in their own culture? Americans are so used to hearing about the educational successes of Asians and Asian Americans, both in the USA and in Asia. That it comes as a shock to hear about children of US-based Japanese businessmen who are labeled learning disabled in American schools and put back. Their inability to perform causal analysis, for example, in history classes, in the most rudimentary way expected of American children, leads to the belief that they are cognitively impaired. Causal analytical skills are not the only respect in which Asians are sometimes held deficient by American educators. Debate is an important educational tool for learning analytic thinking skills and for forcing self-conscious reflection on the validity of one's ideas. This view is shared increasingly by non-Westerners. Debate training is becoming a minor American export industry, with young people from all over the world, but especially Asia, coming to debate camps in the USA. A few years ago, Hee Jung Kim, a graduate student from Korea, studying psychology at Stanford, became exasperated with the constant demand from her American instructors that she speak up in class. She was told repeatedly that failure to speak up could be taken as an indication of failure to fully understand the material, and that, in any case, speaking up and hearing the reactions of the instructor and classmates would help her to understand it better. Kim didn't believe it. Instead, she felt that she and her fellow Asian and Asian American students would not benefit from speaking because their fundamental way of understanding the material was not verbal. There is certainly a long tradition in the East of equating silence rather than speech with knowledge. As the 6th century BC sage Lao Tzu said, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." Kim explains the difference by calling on the distinction made in our work between analytic and holistic thought. Analytic thought who dissects the world into a limited number of discrete objects having particular attributes that can be categorized in clear ways, lends itself to being captured in language. Holistic thought, which responds to a much wider array of objects and their relations, and which makes fewer sharp distinctions among attributes or categories, is less well suited to linguistic representation. To test the possibility that Asians and Asian Americans in fact find it relatively difficult to use language to represent thought. Kim had people speak out loud as they solved various kinds of problems. This had no effect on the performance of Americans, but the requirement to speak out loud had very deleterious effects on the performance of Asians. This work is as convincing as any in this book about the different nature of thought for Asians and Westerners, and its practical implications are extremely important. How should one educate Asians and Asian Americans in American classrooms? Is it a form of colonialism to demand that they perform verbally and share their thoughts with their classmates? Would it have the effect of undermining the skills that goes with a holistic approach to the world? Or is it merely common sense to prepare them for a world in which verbal presentation skills, even if it might be difficult to achieve them, will come in handy? Two advantages of Asian cognition stand out. One, the fact that Asians see more of a given scene or context than Westerners do. And two, the holistic, dialectic, middle way approach to the problems. Leaving aside for the moment the question of whether one should attempt to teach these skills to Westerners, there are some hints from the work of cognitive psychologists David Mayer and David Kieras, that it might be surprisingly easy to open bottlenecks in perceptual and perceptual motor performance. People can be taught to attend to a broader range of different stimuli and respond to them more quickly and accurately with only modest amounts of training. The cognitive aspects of holistic, dialectic approaches to reasoning seem to me to be a different matter entirely. They are so embedded in perception, philosophy, and even temperament that it seemed doubtful that much in the way of change could be achieved. But I would be delighted to be proven wrong. An unchallenged assumption of intelligence testing for the past century is that it is possible to test intelligence in a culture fair way. The experts agree that cultural biases can creep into language-based intelligence tests. Even within a given culture, people of different socio-economic status have different exposures to words, and certainly across cultures and across languages. Comparisons become almost meaningless. But there is a consensus that if intelligence is tested without the use of words, it is reasonable to compare people from different cultures. Have a look at the illustration on page 214. With its many boxes, it shows a problem similar to those found on well-known tests purporting to be culturally unbiased, such as the Cattle Culture Fair Intelligence Test and Raven's Progressive Matrices Test. The task for the person being tested is to look at the first few objects in the matrix at the top and figure out what the next object among the 6 options shown beneath the matrix should be. Everyone has been exposed to circles and rectangles and triangles. So there would seem to be no question of unfair advantage here. It should just be raw intelligence that is being measured. But viewed in the light of ideas proposed in this book, the test can be seen to play to the strengths of Westerners. Let's put some light here. Excuse me. It consists of identifying relevant features, deciding how to categorize them, and finding the rule that best accounts for the way the categories are manipulated. With a research team headed by Dennis Park and Trey Haddon at the University of Michigan and Chi-Cheng Jing of the Chinese Institute of Psychology, I tested the intelligence of American and Chinese college students and elderly people in 3 different ways. By means of speed and memory tests that are correlated with IQ scores. By percentile score for general information in the relevant comparison population, and by the cattle culture fair intelligence test. We equated each of the groups for speed and memory so that young Americans and Chinese had identical scores on average, as did older Americans and Chinese. The young are much faster and have better memories, so it was not possible to equate across age groups for these variables, and had identical percentile scores for information as well. Despite this matching on two very different measures of intelligence, the Americans, both young and old, scored substantially better on the culture fair test than Chinese. The difference was very substantial, more than 4/5 of a standard deviation for readers familiar with statistics. If we took the results of the cattle test seriously and didn't have the other information about abilities, we would have to conclude that Americans were a lot smarter than Chinese. Or would, if we had any claims to an idea of fairness. With the research team headed by Dennis Park and Trey Haddon at the University of Michigan and Qi Cheng-jing of the Chinese Institute of Psychology, I tested the intelligence of American and Chinese college students and elderly people in 3 different ways. By means of speed and memory tests that are correlated with IQ scores. By percentile score for general information in the relevant comparison population, and by the before mentioned cattle culture fair intelligence test. We equated each of the groups for speed and memory so that young Americans and Chinese had identical scores on average, as did older Americans and Chinese, and had identical percentile scores for information as well. The elderly in our samples is usually the case, had somewhat higher information scores than the young. Despite this matching on 2 very different measures of intelligence, the Americans, both young and old, scored substantially better on the culture fair test than the Chinese. The difference was very substantial. It seems that it could be very problematic of any claims to having a random sample of the relevant populations, which we don't. And here is another referral to a test, and I will not exactly go into that. So this culture fair test is compared to 7 coincidence board. And when exposing this to both American and Chinese, the results are quite different. This item looks like it might have been produced by the educational testing service for measuring the spatial relations aptitude of high school seniors. In fact, the problem is more than 1,000 years old, having been designed for the purpose of selecting the mandarinate of China. For whatever reason, Chinese and Japanese today teach elementary students how to solve problems like this. In addition, the particular kinds of spatial analysis required to read and write ideographs and the holistic nature of Asian cultures seem likely to foster spatial skills. And indeed, Asians and Asian Americans are generally found to outperform European Americans on spatial tasks. The differences are usually quite large. Typically, the better part of a standard deviation. if there were any reason to assume that populations were being sampled randomly, this might encourage some people to contend that East Asians are more intelligent than people of European culture. And indeed it has. Just such an assertion is included in the myriad dubious propositions in the book The Bell Curve by Richard Nisbett and Charles Murray. Together with the assertion that the finding is strong evidence of a genetic basis for the difference, since such spatial tests are obviously culture fair. Ethnic diversity has been acclaimed for all sorts of reasons, among them that educational and work environments are enriched by having people of different backgrounds. Our work does strongly support the contention that diverse views should be helpful for problem solving. The cognitive orientations and skills of East Asians and people of European cultures are sufficiently different that it seems highly likely that they would complement and enrich one another in any given setting. We would expect that for most problems one would be better off having a mix of people from different cultures than having people who are all from one culture. Whether such an advantage to diversity will endure depends on whether we are engaged in a worldwide homogenizing process. So I go to the epilogue. Epilogue. The end of psychology, or the clash of mentalists. Social scientists in many fields are now debating two very different views of the future. One view, championed by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama, assumes convergence of world political and economic systems, and consequently of values. And the other predicts continued difference. Fukuyama has written of the end of history, meaning that capitalism and democracy have won, and that there are no forces on the horizon that can generate interesting events, as in the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. The other view, championed by political scientist Samuel Huntington, predicts continued difference. Far from accepting Fukuyama's vision of societal convergence, Huntington has pronounced the world to be on the brink of a clash of civilization, with major cultural groups including East Asia, Islam, and the West locked in opposition to one another due to the irreconcilable differences in values and worldviews. In the emerging world of ethnic conflict and civilizational clash, Western belief in the universality of Western culture suffers three problems. It is false, it is immoral, it is dangerous. Of course, if economies and governmental forms are to be everywhere the same, this would suggest that the psychological characteristics of peoples will be the same. On the other hand, a clash of civilizations suggests the possibility of a continued divergence in the habits of thoughts. So will the cognitive differences documented in this book turn out to be of mere historical interest? Are they going to be gone in 50 or 100 years because social systems and values have converged? Will the universalists then turn out to be right, though for the wrong reasons? Or will they persist as they have for thousands of years? Westernization. Fukuyama's views capture those of many in the West, perhaps especially Americans, who tend to assume that everyone is really an American at heart. Or if not, it's only a matter of time until they will be. There is plenty of superficial evidence to back up this belief. People in every country wear jeans and t-shirts and Nike shoes and drink Cokes and listen to American music and watch American movies and TV. Even France felt it necessary recently to ration the amount of TV of American origin to 25% of the total. On the other hand, they've thrown in the language towel, and all French elementary school children will henceforward learn English. Asian scholars have assured me that higher education in Asia is even more Western in nature. emphasizing analysis, criticism, logic, and formal approaches to problem solving. There is some evidence that socialization of children in the East is moving toward the Western pattern. Harold Stevenson and his colleagues monitored the mothers of children in a particular elementary school in Beijing for more than a decade, beginning in the mid-80s. The mothers concerned were for their children's relational skills, their ability to fit in harmoniously with others. 10 years later, the mothers were interested mostly in the same things that Western mothers are. Does my child have the skills and the independence to go ahead in the world? A few years ago, Kai Ping-peng, Nancy Wong, and I began to realize that many value surveys were actually showing that Easterners were reporting that they held certain Western values more strongly than Westerners did. Indeed, we ourselves found that Beijing University students reported valuing equality, imaginativeness, independence, broad-mindedness, and a varied life more than did University of Michigan students. Whereas Michigan students reported valuing being self-disciplined and loyal, even having respect for tradition and honoring parents and elders, more than did Beijing students. The odd results are probably partly due to the fact that value checklist and even attitude scales are not very good ways of getting at values. When we described scenarios that tacitly pitted values against one another and asked participants how they would behave in those situations, or would prefer for others to behave. We got results that matched the intuitions of Asian and American scholars who study Asia. But if there is any truth to the idea that people tend to become what they are trying to become, or what they say they are, the value service may be an augury of the future. Continued divergence. In Huntington's opinion, the assumption that the world's cultures will be assimilated to those of the West is an illusion bred of myopia and ethnocentrism. The societal differences are sufficiently great that future international conflicts will be more nearly cultural in origin than economic or political as in the past. Islam, the East, and the West are on divergent cultural paths, and the relative influence of the West, because of the economic advances of the Far East and the demographic growth of Islam, is going to decline. The world is not necessarily going to be safe for democracy or free markets. There is certainly evidence that one can call upon in support of this view. Japan has had a capitalist economy for more than 100 years. And capitalism can be expected to promote values of independence, freedom, and rationalism. Yet there are numberless signs that Japan has changed little in many social respects. And we find large differences between the way Japanese and Westerners perceive the world and think about it. Let's have a little look-see here. I wrap up here, approaching the 2-hour limit. This is about as much as the recording can take. I do encourage you to take pauses while listening to this, even if this is very much easier than Smolin. It needs reflection. It needs rest. I understand the cultural perspective of the cosmological fallacies. It's taking apart and shoving one part of the world away that is automatic in our modus of thinking. It's the cutting up and not willing and unwillingness to take in contradictions. Some questions one should ask oneself: how can we tell the world that it doesn't consist of contradictions? It is coming from our thinking, and it's only prevalent in the West. And all of the landscape problem can be cast in this exact form as Nisbett is illustrating. Ignoring the receptacle or the format, ignoring how you put it, and just looking at the content, what's inside. That is the landscape problem. This thing to be ignored, the background, the canvas, and by ignoring that, we come to irreparable and anomalous paradoxes. And this is the reason classical physics only in any scale, whatever macro, micro, meso, will be an approximation by ignoring the background. Westerners tend to look at 3 different things: content before form, ignoring the form, using contradiction unskillfully and too general, so that contradiction sometimes take the upper hand of the whole. And the third one is by taking things apart, we must realize that we've done some sort of artificial rearranging of the world. And as long as we remember that, we will have no problem. But if we forget, I would say, as we have done in the Newtonian paradigm, we get ontologically lost as well. And I would say this latter is more devastating. It's a thinking error that affects everyone, and it's leading into a fallacious reasoning about oneself, one's place in the world, and it's leading to the idea of excluding oneself from the world. It's written more clearly than anyone by Jacques Monod, the French Nobel Prize laureate in 1966, I think. He wrote a book and he said every scientist needs to take himself out of the equation to extinguish all subjective features. Can you see that this is the other side of not understanding inner and outer being the same? This is reflecting each other, mirroring each other perfectly, ignoring the background, the landscape, or the form. Background, form, landscape, background is the same exactly in a holistic approach when you ignore the inner and just try to see the outside. And where does a rationality with laws stay? Well, it stays in the outer part. It's verbal and communicable. But it cannot be good to think with. Its purpose is communication, as was so aptly put to the point by Edward de Bono, last year's sadly deceased megathinker. So there are incredible parallels here, and Nisbett's fantastic explorations are supporting Smoley, David Bader. It is supporting Lisa Friedman Bartet, Barbara Tversky, and I would put in to some extent also Maturana / Varela and their autopoiesis. And it comes to fruition firstly now when one starts to understand it is a mistake of thinking. It's a huge difference. Incredibly interesting. Thank you very much for your patience. Have a very nice afternoon.